Thank you, Dr. Gina Cosgrove, Doug Morrissey, and Laura Marks for joining us today for From Progress to Placement, Least Restrictive Environment for Every Student. Please take it away.
All right, I'll start us off. I'm Laura Marks. I am a staff attorney at Disability Rights New York, and I will start us through the presentation. And then I don't know, Doug and Gina, do you want to introduce yourselves before we get going, or do you want to?
Yeah, maybe that's best so everyone has a sense of who we are. I'll start. I'm Dr. Gina Cosgrove. I'm a psychologist. I own a practice in Clifton Park, New York called Chelsea Place Psychological Services. And through that practice, we have students and patients and families come in for independent evaluations, diagnostic testing, counseling and support. And also we consult with many of the local school districts in terms of student supports as well as training for staff.
I'm Doug Morrissey, Director of Special Education for Bethlehem Central School District. We are in the Albany area, work closely with Dr. Cosgrove, actually, in a number of situations. We're directly south of Albany on the Hudson River and have about 4,100 students at this time.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, thank you. The governing laws and regulations are the IDEA, which is the federal, and Part 200 of New York regulations, which is, of course, New York State. All students are entitled to receive their education in the least restrictive environment that is appropriate for their specific needs. Students who receive special education should have an IEP that explains where they should be receiving their education, and that determination has to be made on an individualized basis, and each student must be educated in the general education setting to the maximum extent that is appropriate for each individual student. And then the concept of the least restrictive environment gives rise to this continuum of services, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But at the bottom of this slide and several others, there's a graphic that shows this continuum of placements and services. Next slide, please. One thing we talk about a lot with respect to the least restrictive environment is the appropriate placement for a student. And when we talk about this generally, it doesn't seem like there should be a material difference between placement and location. But when it comes to special education, this is an important distinction. So placement refers to the type of class that you'll find on the IEP. So this is general education or 1211 along this placement continuum. The location is where the student receives their education. So think school, teacher, classroom. Right. And students are entitled to the least restrictive placement, not the least restrictive location. And I think that's an important thing for parents and CSE team members to really remember, is that it's the placement that is key here. And that's why this distinction between placement and location is so important. And this slide and the next slide are going to be incredibly oversimplified explanations of placement versus location. So here you can see that the student is entitled to placement in a 1211. That's what the CSE team has determined is the least restrictive placement for this particular student. And then we have 3 different 1211s in 3 different schools with 3 different teachers. This is why this is oversimplified. But all 3 could potentially be an appropriate placement for this student because all 3 are the correct placement 1211. And that's what the CSE team determined was the least restrictive placement, and as close to general education as was appropriate for this particular student. There are a lot of other factors that go into it, and not the least of which is that the placement has to be based on similarity of needs. So not all 1211s are the same. Not every student who should be placed in a 1211 can go into any 1211. And again, we have this oversimplified graphic. We have 3 different placements all at the same school. The agreed upon placement is the 1211, so the 1511 is inappropriate and the 811 is not appropriate. Even though we have 3 classrooms in the same school, they're still technically different locations. It's possible that, for the purposes of this example, Abbott Elementary has 3 1211 classes, and 2 of those 3 are appropriate for this student. And between 5th and 6th grade, both of those placements are still available and still appropriate for this student. But this student changes from one teacher's classroom, so one 1211, to another 1211. Here the placement is the same, but the location is different. The student is entitled to the placement, but not entitled to stay in that teacher's classroom from 5th to 6th grade. A lot of times we'll see families that are upset because the student did really well in that 5th grade classroom with that teacher. But again, it is the placement that they are entitled to, not the particular teacher, not the school, not the classroom number. And then this is the continuum of services. It's the range of services and placements available to students to meet their individual needs. Notice that in this description, it's not just the placement, so it's not just that classroom type that we just talked about. It includes the supports and services that are available to students to help keep them in that least restrictive placement. And then this is just a very brief overview of those placements along the continuum. So we have the general education placement, which is with peers who do not have IEPs. Integrated co-teaching classrooms, which are the only placement that districts get to choose whether or not to offer. And there's one gen ed teacher and one special education teacher in that classroom. Then we have the self-contained classrooms, which are what I think people generally associate with special education learning. This is the classroom that is all students with IEPs. These classrooms, again, have to be based on similarity of needs. Day programs are also self-contained classrooms. You might think of a BOCES when you think of a day program. Residential programming is where students live at the school. So this is similar to a boarding school. There's therapeutic programming around the clock. It is important to note, though, that this is a restrictive placement. And so it has to be necessary to meet the educational goals of the student. I want to make that distinction that educational and behavioral are not the same goals. So it has to be necessary to meet the educational goals of the student that are in the IEP. And there has to be some sort of expectation or plan to remove the student to a less restrictive but appropriate placement at some point. And finally, we have home and hospital-based instruction. This is only for students with documented physical, mental, or emotional need. This is not for students who are waiting on placement to become available at a different, less restrictive placement. Right, I'm going to go through keeping students in their appropriate placement, particularly when a more restrictive placement is presented by the CSE team. The 2 big things I think need to be considered are communication and available supports. So communication with the district and the CSE team on what the concern is can help parents or guardians and the rest of the CSE team understand the issue and strategize how to mitigate those issues. Then once there is that open line of communication and everyone understands the concerns, part of the process is identifying what supports have and have not been used. For supports that have been used, it's important to talk about why those were successful and why those were unsuccessful. What other supports are going to be helpful in keeping the student in the least restrictive placement. The CSE team doesn't have to get it right 100% from the start. This is an ongoing determination of what is going to help the student stay in a less restrictive but appropriate placement. If a suggested support isn't effective in the way that the CSE team thought it might be, it doesn't necessarily mean that a more restrictive placement is the next step. It might be coming back to the CSE meeting and talking with the rest of the committee on what a different support might be appropriate and available to that student to stay in a less restrictive and appropriate placement. When having that ongoing communication between the members of the CSE team, this slide has some questions to consider. So you want to talk about proper implementation of the IEP. That proper implementation is critical for the student. If the supports that the team agreed were necessary aren't properly implemented, it's not going to be a surprise when that student struggles, but that's not indicative of a need to change to a more restrictive placement. That's indicative of a need to follow the agreed upon supports and services for that student. For students who have significant behaviors, it's also important to have up-to-date FBAs or behavior intervention plans. That's functional behavioral assessment and behavioral intervention plan are those two acronyms. FBAs can be redone before the reevaluation period if that's necessary. It's really important to, think about it. Kids grow so quickly that it's important to consider that new behaviors may pop up and old modification tools might not be working anymore, and we have to reevaluate what's going to be appropriate to help this student. All right. Next slide, thank you. And then this is a snapshot of the supports and services that might be available. We have the consultant teacher services. This can be direct or indirect, meaning that there can either be a special education teacher providing direct educational support in the classroom or providing behind the scenes support to the gen ed teacher. Resource rooms are to provide students who need that supplemental instruction with the opportunity to learn in addition to that classroom time. And again, this has to be grouped on similarity of need. Then we have supplemental aids and services, which I think, again, are what people a lot of the time think of when they think of supports and services. This is your OT, your PT, speech counseling, you name it. And then we have teaching assistants and aides. This can, again, range in how they are implemented, and it can be classroom-wide or it can be one-on-one. And again, the goal with these supports and services is to allow the student to have the support that they need to stay in that less restrictive placement or to go into the less restrictive placement. When determining if a student is placed in the least restrictive environment, we have to consider those supports and services in addition to the student's placement. So while it could be easy to say that a student needs to go to a more restrictive placement because supports are not available, we just don't have the staff, the personnel, which is a real issue right now, is we don't have enough people. But those supports and services are part of that continuum and part of the least restrictive environment that student is entitled to stay in a less restrictive placement that is appropriate for that student. And then this is just a snapshot of how to ensure the least restrictive environment, talking points with the CSE team, things to consider when we're talking about where the student should be placed. Right, and sometimes changing placement is appropriate. Sometimes the CSE team does agree that a more restrictive placement is needed for this student. We've tried the supports and services in a less restrictive placement, and the student just needs more support than that. And during that time, it's still important to advocate for the student. It might be necessary to get new evaluations. If we're looking at moving from in-district to a more restrictive setting like a day program or residential, the district can sometimes include a cover letter in the packets that are being sent for those placements. A lot of times parents want behavioral records removed from that packet that is being sent to new placements. We can't get those taken out, but it can be helpful to supplement the information to give a better understanding of maybe what led to the incidents, or if there has been a change in the student's behavior since then, or even if there was a lack of support for that student when those incidents occurred that the parent is concerned about being included in that packet. Sometimes those behaviors will deter placements from accepting the student because there's not that similarity of need that appears on the paper between students. All right. And then when a student is waiting for placement, like I said, there are a lot of students who are waiting for placements. The CSE team has decided and agreed that this placement is not supportive enough for the student, and we need a more restrictive one. But there are so many kids who are waiting for those openings that just don't exist right now. And it's important to know as the CSE team that home instruction is not an appropriate stopgap for that student. Just because there is not the placement available to them does not mean they automatically go to the most restrictive setting while waiting for it. So advocate as the CSE team for an in-person service. Log the time that the student is out of school, and have those open lines of communication with the CSE team to figure out what can be implemented to provide a less restrictive placement than strictly home instruction. And then unilateral placement is when a parent or guardian places a student in a private placement before the CSE team agrees to it. This is something that if you're considering, I really, really strongly recommend that you talk to an attorney, because as you can see, there are requirements for reimbursement and you don't want to be out of pocket for that private placement if those requirements are not met. And then ensuring that the student's rights are enforced while they're waiting for that placement. So this is the student who has been, the CSE team has decided that a more restrictive placement is appropriate and necessary, but we're still looking for that placement to open up. These are just some options of what to discuss with the CSE team as a CSE team. So for example, if there's a student who does really well in specials like PE and art, and they can be placed in school with their peers during those times, but really struggles during math class, work with the CSE team and figure out what can be done to make sure that student has peer interaction when it's appropriate and available for that student. Tutoring on campus, again, this is certainly more restrictive than other placements on the continuum, but it's less restrictive than them being at home on their computer on Zoom or, whatever it is now for home instruction. And keep that line of communication amongst the CSE team open so that if there are changes in the student, that can be communicated amongst the team. If art is no longer a viable option for this student, but PE still is, we can modify that day to look like what it needs to ensure that this student is in the least restrictive placement. So when a CSE team determines a student placement, but that placement isn't available, which again is happening frequently these days, the district has an obligation to report to the New York State Education Department, NYSED. NYSED is then on notice that there's a gap in the service, and they should, in a perfect world, step in to ensure that students are not just waiting around for placements and being placed on home instruction and sitting there, waiting to have that appropriate placement available to them. So it's important to make sure that, if the district isn't already doing it, make sure the district knows that it's something that they're supposed to do so that you can ensure NYSED is put on notice that there is this issue. All right, and I'm not going to go through these one by one. They are in the slide deck, though, for anybody who is interested. I know Helen sent out that slide deck earlier. These are the students' rights if an appropriate placement is not available. So again, that example of the student who the CSE team determined requires a more restrictive placement, but that placement is not yet open. These are just the steps that can be taken. The CSE team meeting state education quality assurance report. They won't provide one-on-one advocacy for a student, but they can investigate a report. And state complaint can be a complaint to the New York State Department of Education explaining what's going on and that the student is not receiving education in the least restrictive placement. Then there's more information about all of these, again, in the slide deck.
Question, Laura, if that's all right.
Mhm, yeah.
We had someone ask, when you say report to NYSED when there's a gap, is that reporting to the district SED regional associate?
I'm not sure I understand. So when I say reporting to NYSED, NYSED is the state education agency, and the district would be underneath their authority, their supervisory authority. So the district is reporting to the state to say that there is this issue, that we have this student that doesn't have a spot available. I don't know if that answers the question though.
I think that's helpful.
Okay.
If they put anything else in, I'll let you know. But
Okay,
now
thank you.
I'll go to the next slide.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, Helen, you'll have to click through a few of these. These are all just the further explanation of what was on that one slide.
So that brings us to me. Again, my name is Doug Morrissey, Director of Special Education for Bethlehem Central School District. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I've only been in Bethlehem since October. Prior to that, I served in a similar position in Cairo Durham schools in Greene County. If you're not from the Albany area, Greene County is the county directly south of Albany County. And Cairo Durham was a much smaller school district, about 1,000 students there, with about a 20% identification rate for special education. I'm also the dad of a now young adult person with a disability, and have been down this road and making these decisions for her as well. So I bring all that to the table. And I think it really gives me a bit of a unique perspective about the role of least restrictive environment with special education. My goal in the next few minutes is to really give you some insight into, as a school leader, the things I have to consider around least restrictive environment. The first of those is the law, of course. Laura mentioned some of this. Here's what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act says. Really, and just to summarize, to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities should be educated alongside their non-disabled peers. Removal to special classes or separate schooling should only happen when there's a severity of when the severity of a disability makes it impossible for the student to succeed in a general ed setting, even when they have supports and services. So it's not just about the classroom setting. It's about a philosophy of inclusion and access. But achieving that balance really requires careful decision-making. And that brings us to what New York State says about least restrictive environment. So the state's regulations, of course, mirror the IDEA. They would have to, of course, but they bring a couple of extra points to the table as well. The state specifically highlights that students must receive special education they need. Schools must maximize opportunities for students with disabilities to participate in academic and extracurriculars with their non-disabled peers. And lastly, the placement should be as close to the student's home as possible. So that reinforces that LRE, it's not just about a location, it's about access and services and supports that allow students to thrive without unnecessary segregation. Now, considering a comparison of the two, this is just a little breakdown of how IDEA versus New York State regulations approaches the idea of least restrictive environments. Really, the point here is that inclusion is always the goal, but LRE must be implemented in a way that ensures some kind of meaningful progress for the student. It's not just about finding a seat for a kid in a classroom. It's about finding the right seat in the right placement that provides the student the opportunity to make meaningful progress. Considering from the point of view of a school leader, what is LRE, what is not LRE? Well, I always try to think of LRE as a framework that ensures students receive appropriate supports in the least restrictive setting in which they can show progress. I always consider LRE as an individualized decision made by the CSE. And lastly, it really has to be a balance between access and specialized instruction. So how do we provide the student the greatest access to the general education setting while offering them the specialized instruction they need to make adequate progress? Then I think about what LRE is not. Well, LRE is not a mandate for full inclusion in all cases. I'm familiar with school districts who have said, we're going to place every kindergartner in a general education program, regardless of what their needs are. That's not LRE, right? LRE is when a student can make meaningful progress in their placement. So you have to consider that before making those decisions. LRE is not a placement decision based on the resources rather than the student needs. Laura kind of touched on this. It's not about what do we have that we can give to the student. It's about what the student needs. And lastly, it's not a one-size-fits-all model. You can't do the same thing for every single student you work with and think, oh yeah, this is LRE. It has to be individualized. Considering LRE in the continuum of placements, this little graphic is my far weaker attempt than Laura's had at a similar graphic that really talks about the continuum of services. And I suspect that most of us have a grasp on what these all are. But my point here really is that our goal should always to be place students in the least restrictive setting where they can make meaningful progress. So the farther to the left on this graphic that you can find a placement for a student where they can show meaningful progress, the better for that student and the more attentive to the LRE requirements you're being. Now, across New York State, we really have a variety of school districts, right? We have everything from districts with a couple hundred students to districts with millions of students. And each one of those settings provides a special challenge for a person in a position like mine. If you think about LRE in small schools, next slide, please. Small schools really have face some unique challenges due largely to limited resources and the need for specialized staff. A small school like where I spent a good chunk of my career in Cairo, Durham, there just are not enough students to provide every possible program any student who comes to the door might need. We really needed to be very creative, and but that need to be creative offered us opportunities as well. We had to be flexible with our inclusion models. We had to be able to allow students to move in and out of different programs throughout the day to meet their LRE needs, depending on what the different subject was. We also had to partner with neighboring school districts as well. For example, in Cairo, Durham, we offered a special class setting for students who were Our neighboring school district, Greenville Central Schools, did not offer a program of that nature, but did offer a program for students with behavioral and social and emotional needs. We would often have students moving back and forth between our schools so that we could meet those students' needs in their least restrictive environment. Now, thinking about medium-sized schools, and this would include a school much like where I am now, Bethlehem Schools, about just shy of 4,500 students, certainly large for the Albany area, but not large in comparison to places like Rochester, Buffalo, New York, and so on. Medium districts have more resources than smaller ones, but we still face challenges in providing a full continuum of services. For example, a student with autism might require a self-contained class for one part of the day, but could transition to perhaps a co-taught setting in another part of the day. A challenge I face in my elementary school, and we have 5 elementaries, is that those programs could be in different school buildings. That really limits that student's ability to receive instruction in their LRE. An opportunity it creates for us, though, is the opportunity to use things like push-in services and co-teaching models to help students remain in gen ed while receiving specialized supports. Now, large school districts have their own challenges and opportunities. For example, large districts often have a broad range of specialized programs, but ensuring equity in those programs can be a challenge. If you took, for an example, a school district that has 2 high schools in it, one might have a very robust specialized behavior program, but the other one might have a robust program for students with autism. That really creates placement gaps. That how, if a student has needs that could be addressed in both of those, yet the schools are miles apart within the same school district, that's a real challenge. An opportunity that's created, though, is the opportunity to use data-driven decision-making to expand programs based on needs. Often large districts have vast data management systems that can really be used to help folks in jobs like mine make decisions about program development. Another consideration, regardless of your size, is really the needs of students with emotional disabilities versus social challenges. In fact, I've come to find it one of the biggest challenges here in Bethlehem. And that is that differentiating between a student with an emotional disability and one with some kind of social maladjustment. This chart just kind of outlines the differences in between the two and different types of behavior you may see in schools. One example is a student with an emotional disability who might struggle with anxiety or depression that prevents them from learning, while a student with the social maladjustment might be disruptive largely by choice. Those differences could have similar results and could lead school staff to say this student needs a specialized program. But the difference between emotional disability and social maladjustment is really what is the root cause of the behavior. And we have to consider that when considering the right placement decisions. Laura talked a bit about students without placements. That's a significant challenge for us right now in roles such as mine. I've found in the last 11 or 12 years doing this type of work that opportunities for specialized placements have gotten harder and harder to find, right? It's one of the most complex challenges is supporting students who do not have an immediate placement. These students often do not align with available programs in their school district, or they might be those who are waiting for an appropriate placement decision to be made. So some of the key considerations I have to make in cases like this are, what are appropriate interim supports? While we work towards a long-term solution to find the student the right program, the student still needs educational support. That can include things like temporary services and general education. Perhaps we're going to use a one-on-one aide or teaching assistant in a general ed program to provide support. Perhaps we're going to consider flexible scheduling to accommodate this student. The student may be in one program for one part of the day. Another consideration we have to make is collaboration with general education. We have to ensure that students remain engaged in learning while their placement is determined. So maybe we want to be considering different modifications to their academic program, like adjusted assignments, additional scaffolding, or some kind of alternate assessment program for those students while they wait. Then we have to consider behavioral and academic interventions. Many students without placements have both behavioral, social, emotional, and academic challenges. We need to think about interventions like counseling or check-in and check-out systems or mentoring programs to help provide stability. The last thing we really need to think about is compliance considerations. right? It's essential that while we work through placement issues, we remain in compliance with both IDEA and state regulations. This means that we have to ensure students receive the required IEP services while they're waiting. We have to ensure that they receive the required amount of instruction, as Laura outlined on one of her slides, for the elementary level, 10 hours a week, and for the secondary level, 15 hours a week. We have to document why placements have not been finalized and what steps are being taken. And we have to make sure we're communicating with families and ensuring their input is valued in this entire process. The reality is there's always going to be gaps in available programs, and some students will never fit neatly into any of the existing programs. Our role as school leaders has to be ensure that no student falls through the cracks by implementing things like temporary supports, strengthening collaboration, and advocating program development where needed. Addressing gaps in existing programs. Next slide, please. This is one of the biggest challenges we have in implementing LRE. And it's really that our current programming does not always meet every student's needs. Often current programming meets the needs of the kids we used to have, the kids we have, or the kids we know that are coming. Some students require services that don't even yet exist in our schools, leaving us with gaps that impact their ability to receive FAPE. Some of the considerations for a school leader are first to identify gaps in services. The first step in closing programming gaps is to do just that, asking ourselves questions like, are students being placed out of district because we don't have the appropriate supports? Are students struggling in their current placements due to insufficient behavioral, academic, or social and emotional supports? Or are certain disability categories over in our more restrictive settings due to a lack of specialized services in general education? Right now in Bethlehem, we have an abundance of students placed in a local BOCES program for students with severe emotional disabilities. The classroom itself is a 412 classroom, and 3 of those students are Bethlehem students. That is an area we're looking at to consider what can we do in district to better serve those students in a less restrictive programming. Then we have to develop solutions to fill those gaps, right? Once we identify the gaps, we need practical solutions. This might include things like expanding integrated co-teaching models to include more subjects or more grade levels. It might include increasing specialized support staff, things like hiring a behavior specialist, having additional school psychologists or social workers on hand. And lastly, partnering with external agencies to bring additional services into schools. In Cairo, Durham, we had a strong partnership with Greene County Office of Mental Health, where they housed mental health counselors right in our school buildings. I know that that's a frequently used service and one that we need to consider as a way to keep students in their least restrictive environments. Lastly, we have to monitor the effectiveness of what we're doing. Creating a program is not enough. We need to make sure it works effectively. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, are students achieving progress towards our IEP goals in these programs? Are referrals for more restrictive placements decreasing? And are families and staff satisfied with these new supports? Data tracking on student outcomes, behavioral progress, and academic achievement has to guide future program adjustments. Addressing programming gaps is just one of the most complex yet critical responsibilities people face in positions like mine. The goal isn't just about compliance, but it's about ensuring all students have meaningful opportunities to succeed in the least restrictive environment in which they can show meaningful progress. So a few other things to consider as a school leader in the LRE decision-making process. Good LRE decisions rely on having the most complete continuum of services you can offer as a school district, having temporary supports for students pending placement, identifying and addressing those program gaps, which I discussed a few minutes ago, And collaborating, not just with families and teachers, but with your neighboring school districts, with other agencies, with professionals who work in private practice, whoever you can collaborate with to find the solutions that students need. We have to on our LRE decisions based on student needs and outcomes. Some specific roles for a leader in special education.
If you don't mind pausing just for a sec,
Sure.
every now and then your voice pauses and then it sort of speeds to catch up. Would you mind turning off your camera and seeing if that may help with the buffering?
Well, that's no problem. And anybody looking at me probably appreciates me turning.
No, we'll see if that works. Thank you so much.
Let's see if that works. So next slide, please. So as school leaders, we have a responsibility to ensure that continuum of services is available. As I mentioned, that's something that we're currently refining here in Bethlehem. We have to provide professional development to teachers. The needs of kids constantly change. And making sure that our staff, not just teachers, are prepared to meet those needs is a responsibility of folks like myself. We have to foster collaborative decision-making, and we have to use data to drive placements and service decisions. There's always a role for professional judgment, of course, but really using data to make sure that we're providing students services in the most important, in the least restrictive environment is critical. Some challenges we face in implementing LRE decisions: staffing and resources. Without a doubt, Laura mentioned it. It is, I think, the largest challenge we face right now. As an example, if you're not familiar with Bethlehem schools, we're a relatively affluent school district, relatively well-paying school district. I moved here in October and thought, man, hiring is never going to be a problem here. Everybody will love to work at Bethlehem. And we pretty quickly had to fill a school psychologist position. We had one applicant for that position, just one. So that just, shows that the challenges that even more affluent school districts are facing. Another challenge is shifting of mindsets. Too many still see special education as this separate thing, this place kids go to learn. And we need to continue to work to shift the mindset of special education not being a place, but being integrated into the entire school system. Behavioral and academic support gaps continue, and ensuring that our parental concerns and parental understanding of LRE decisions is really important as well. A couple strategies for effective LRE decision-making. To make LRE really work, we have to use data to drive decisions. I know I mentioned this just a moment ago. One of the questions I constantly get from staff is, why do you depend so much on data? I know my students. I'm a professional. Yes, professional input is important. But knowing how students are progressing towards goals, having data to support that is critical. We have to prioritize collaboration across our teams. It's really the only way to ensure that students will receive services across a school district. If students could spend one part of a day with one team and another with another team, that could help them and save them from going somewhere else. Lastly, we have to conduct regular placement reviews to ensure students are in the right setting. Certainly at annual review, we need to have those discussions, but more frequently if possible. If a student is really showing positive progress, we need to make sure that we're having discussions throughout the year on moving them to less restrictive environments. Finally, a couple takeaways I had in my thinking on this, and a couple things I want to note. First, LRE has to be individualized. I've worked in a situation where every student, regardless of what their need was going to be placed in the same program, because the concept was that, well, we need to see if the student can work in general education first. That's not LRE. That's not taking into account each individual student's needs. General education should be the initial consideration, of course, but we have to consider the individual student's needs. Leadership is really critical. Pushing people to expand their horizons, pushing people to collaborate is the role of a leader in a position like mine. And lastly, that regular review and adaptation of placements for students should be an ongoing push for leaders in positions like mine. So those are some of the challenges we face in school leadership positions around LRE, and thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks so much. We don't have any questions in the chat, and so I will pass it over to Dr. Cosgrove.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, such great information so far. I'm learning some new things myself. This is wonderful. Okay, can you hear me okay? We're good? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So as I mentioned before, I'm a psychologist and I run a practice called Chelsea Place Psychological Services. So my role will be really to come at this from a clinical perspective. So at our practice, we either receive our referrals from families. So families will come to us independently, asking for a diagnostic assessment. Sometimes it's related to school programming, and sometimes it's just more related to treatment planning in the community and home-based behavioral supports. But either way, we really do try to serve children and families across different settings. And with that, we've really developed some wonderful collaborative relationships and partnerships with local school districts, and now have contracts with districts to also provide diagnostic assessments, IEEs, or independent educational evaluations, as well as school-based consultation and program development support. So that's been really exciting. And last count, we were up to about 100 school districts across New York State that we've been able to consult with at some level. So that's nice for us because we really get to see programs across around the state as far as what this continuum looks like, how it's being implemented, and then being able to share and cross-pollinate those ideas across the districts, which is great. You know, our number one priority is always to be, you know, serving the students that that come to us for those assessments, and whether there's agreement or not agreement among parents and districts, we really do try to maintain that focus that the student is kind of our client, and that's our role as an advocate. So with this experience, we've been able to really see what this continuum looks like in actual real time, and what are some of the benefits of inclusion, and what are some of the questions to ask yourself. As everyone was talking today, one of the things that I was thinking about is that it's so important to really understand, you know, what the gen ed supports are in place, because before we even want a student to get into a special education, or they need a special education support program within their district or outside of their district, what has been done up to that point. And one of the values, I think, of a really good assessment, whether that's in collaboration with the school psychologist or with our practice or other psychologists, is to really understand what are those developmental levels that the student is presenting with. Because if we're mismatching, that's a lot of the time what we see when a program is not working, and why a student may need a more restrictive setting, is that there's this mismatch between, could be cognitive abilities, could be speech and language abilities, could be motor and sensory processing, could be a result of a diagnostic disorder such as autism or an emotional disability. So really coming up with a really well-developed student profile, and understanding, okay, what can we do in the gen ed setting first and foremost through our MTSS, if the district has some preventive services or RTI services, what are we doing just even before we get into the special ed world, so to say. So making sure a really good assessment is done, and not just from psychologists, but really a multidisciplinary assessment. So speech and language, OT, whatever profile of need that student has. And with that, we really kind of enter in, I think, so much more informed. Like Doug said, the data is so important to be able to guide the decisions that we're making. So we're always leaning towards, of course, less restrictive settings. But before we even get there, I want to make sure that we are, for instance, differentiating instruction. So if I have a student that has a learning disability or a cognitive impairment, but really does benefit from being in a gen ed setting because they really do absorb information, in a different way, or they benefit from the social aspect of being in the classroom, or perhaps even their adaptive living skills. I see a lot of kids that have cognitive disabilities when they're in gen ed settings. To some extent, they are more independent. They they kind of rely on themselves a little bit more. They quote unquote rise to the occasion because they have their peer models. So as much as possible, we want to make sure we're differentiating. When a student's being integrated, I don't expect that that student has to do every single thing that everybody else is doing in that classroom. If they're not understanding the ELA lesson or not understanding the math lesson, how are we differentiating it to make sure that it's accessible to them? So does that mean that I'm paring down how many problems a student is doing? I'll get into that a little later. Sometimes, but sometimes it's managing even the content. How am I presetting and pre-teaching the student? What materials do they have that look differently available to them during the lesson so that they're getting the information at their developmental level. So really being very creative with how we are including our kids, because it's really critical to their development. With that said, we know that students can have sometimes needs that go beyond what can be differentiated, what can be supported in those environments. And that's when we work with teachers and parents and team members to see what other options on that continuum would make more sense. But really, studies do tell us that the more time that children spend in general education, they perform better, especially on their reading and math assessments, if they're able to access the curriculum. So we're always striving towards that as a goal to have inclusion to the greatest degree possible. We know too that there are social and behavioral benefits. So when students with disabilities are included in general education settings, they tend to have fewer disciplinary referrals. So they miss fewer days of school. So again, if it's an appropriate setting and we're getting the supports and services that were just described, we often can have really nice benefits. I have some students that have been in self-contained classrooms, and one of the criteria, quote unquote, for them to having behavioral needs, one of the criteria for them to go out into mainstream environment is to show self-regulation behaviors within their self-contained setting. And often that leads to them never actually having that opportunity. So really using that as a metric is not fair, because we know that there may be students that actually, when they are around their gen ed peers, that some of those behaviors are much improved. So really being careful about kind of what metrics we're using for inclusion, such as, well, he doesn't understand that level of math, it wouldn't make sense to him. Well, he's still having tantrums and needs lots of breaks, so it wouldn't make sense for him. Really taking a look at that and really trying to see if there are some parts of the day where the student could be out into the mainstream and into the gen ed setting with support to have those experiences. There was also some research that children who are included more are more likely to engage in extracurricular activities outside of their school day. So, being able to access, whether it's unified sports at the end of the day, or maybe they're involved in some community activities. So they become part of their school communities, but also their neighborhood communities. And that's our ultimate goal, is to really be able to have our kids not only get a good education, but be socialized so that they can later, go on to have different experiences. Okay, next one. Next slide. Yep, there we go. Okay, another why. So also what we're learning in the research and through direct experience is that when students have opportunities at whatever level is appropriate for them to be included, they're also there are higher likelihood of graduating from high school and being able to access post-secondary education. So that could mean that they attend college, that could mean that they have some employment, that could mean that they are beginning to learn independent living skills. But we know that having at least some of that experience allows them to have more opportunities once they graduate. So in our area, we've had some wonderful opportunities for some students that in the past wouldn't normally have an opportunity to attend college, but now with some inclusive programs, even at the college setting, what we're seeing is that some kids can now move into, whether it's credit-bearing courses or non-credit-bearing courses, have that college experience and really, continue their education post-high school. So that's why all the more reason we're working towards, building these inclusive experiences for them as younger students. I talk a lot about, being able to like practice your skills in different settings. And, if you could do it in Stewart's, then it's probably okay, because if Stewart's is a local, probably anywhere around New York State, I think, a local convenience store. If you can do this, have this behavior in Stewart's, then, it'll probably be okay and acceptable. But if it's not, it's something we should be working on, because it's something that I want to make sure that student has that opportunity to be in these less restrictive settings once they leave school. Very important. There's a wonderful program in New York State. Syracuse University actually runs a program called Inclusive U. And I had an opportunity to learn about this at a conference probably about 7 or 8 years ago through the Council for Exceptional Children, and have had since a chance to visit the program. On a personal note, my son attended Syracuse University and ended up being one of the mentors for the program, and still has contact and has a good friendship with one of the students he mentored. So really just having that, really that real life experience post high school is so critical for for our kids. We know too that there are faculty and staff benefits to inclusion. So when staff are provided with consistent support systems by wonderful leaders like Doug, when we know that they're getting the backup they need, they're getting the trainings they need to really be able to implement differentiation of instruction, to be able to have resources where, it was particularly with regards to technology, when we know we can have assistive technology that allows our kids to really access different levels of instruction simultaneously while the teacher is teaching, that's all, all the resources that are going to help that teacher or the staff in that program feel a sense of success in meeting students with diverse needs. So in most teachers, if they feel they have that support, in addition to having that mindset shift that Doug was mentioning earlier, that that special education is not a place, it's not where kids go, it's happening in your class, and you can be an active part of that. In a lot of our trainings, we spend a lot of time with teachers and assistants and related service providers, helping to understand that everybody has a role here. It's not just the special ed teacher that's in charge, quote unquote, of that student. Or it's not just the aide that's assigned to that particular student that's in charge of that student. I want to see, when I go into a classroom, I want to see that it's really it's a team-based approach, and that everyone is really taking ownership of the student's success. So that's helpful. Next. Okay. So when I go into a classroom, some of the slides didn't kind of show up all the way here. Let's see, I have it on mine. Okay, so what am I looking for? What are we looking for? What are some of the criteria that, the experiences that we think are going to have the most impact on these students? So when doing a classroom observation or doing some consultation, what I'd like to see, what's true inclusion, would be that all students are sitting and working together. Now, I'm not saying that there are some students definitely that need, and some students that request actually, a quieter space sometimes to get their work done. So maybe they have a little side desk off to the side of the classroom that's kind of their working space when they're doing their independent work. And it's just maybe there's a little quieter area, the reduction of some sensory input, totally fine. But for the most part, really want to see all students sitting and working together, particularly when there's a collaborative activity. I really want to see that the adults are trying to encourage that and facilitate that interaction between students, that the student just isn't seeking out the adult or their aide to get that information or to get that activity completed, that the person that's supporting the student is really acting as almost like a bridge, right? Whether that's through communication skills, whether that's through some social coaching, whether that is through helping them understand the content, but really getting into more collaboration and really acting as a guide. So when each student has access to the general education curriculum and that it's adapted to meet their needs, as I mentioned, there's so much technology available today even through the students' Chromebooks. We can have speech to text, text to speech options for students. We can have settings on their Chromebook so that they're accessing reading material or curriculum material that's at their grade level. There's a wonderful website that we've been using now called Magic School, which really offers teachers real-time access to modifications and differentiation based on content of a topic in a class. So we're really, there's lots available. So there's minimum reason that a student that just may have some learning needs not to be as, fully included as they can be. With that said, they also, often need more direct instruction and intense instruction in their particular area of disability as well. So yes, I want that student to be, exposed, and I want that student to be, really part of their general education, the content, but I also want to make sure if that student has a reading disability that they're getting that direct instruction in reading so that they continue to make progress. That's really the best of both worlds, and really where we want to see the, the student thrive in both settings. We want to, certainly make sure that we're identifying the strengths of each student. So that's not just working on, their needs and their deficits, but that we recognize that there are particular strengths that this student brings to the table that, in some ways, I wish that IEPs did a little bit better job with that, because I've had some students that I work with that are older reflect on that and say, gee, I wish there were more things in this document that, or in this IEP that, talked about the things I do well. And that makes so much sense, because we really want to make sure that we are strength-based, and we're taking that perspective for lots of reasons. And as I said before, making sure that our team is working together, that not one person is kind of taking all the ownership, that I'm not the one that has to make all the visuals and do all the curriculum modifications and do all the parent communication and so on, that we're really kind of sharing that. And when we do, and even when goals are written, when IEP goals are written in a way that kind of crosses over disciplines, that's really where we start to see a lot of growth and a lot of generalization of skills. So those are good things. Okay, next one. Right, I'm gonna try not to repeat myself here. Oh, I think I lost the presentation. Do you see it? You do? Okay, all right, okay, good. All right, so what does inclusion not look like? So as I said, the student with a disability spends the majority of their time sitting off to the side or to the back of the room. The student only interacts with their aide, only interacts with their special ed teacher, doesn't really have any contact with the other students or interaction. The gen ed teacher doesn't necessarily, and this can happen for different reasons. I definitely have seen where sometimes a gen ed teacher isn't sure what his or her role is in being able to modify or being able to answer a student's questions or even manage a behavior issue. So we really try to give everybody that, hey, we're all on equal footing here. And the more we can, kind of help the student understand that the gen ed teacher, if they're the core teacher, that's the person that we want the student to access if they're not sure about something. That's the person to access if, you need something repeated. How are we teaching our kids to self-advocate and not just be over dependent and over reliant on on a special ed teacher or an aide. We make sure again that that as much as possible what the student is working on is related to the curriculum. So I'm not saying that this doesn't mean the student may not need some additional materials just to keep them occupied, but for the most part, what's in front of them should be very parallel, even if they're not at the same level, very parallel to what the other students are doing. I remember seeing this actually, Doug, when you were at Cara Durham, and I observed one of the life skills classes there. And I was so impressed when the life skills self-contained teacher had pushed into a social studies class. I think it was a 7th grade social studies class. And the students were, had intellectual disabilities, nonverbal, students with autism. And I'm like, wow, this is going to be interesting. It's a lesson on Egypt, and we're taught lots of language and lots of information. And sure enough, the special ed teacher came in and co-developed with the gen ed teacher some wonderful, picture books and even some PEX cards, things that students could manipulate that paralleled all the vocabulary, all the lesson, most of it anyway, that was occurring, and the students could access that and really be actively engaged. That's, and I know that's not 100% always possible in all content areas, but to the degree it is, those students really, you could see that when they were there, they felt they had a sense of purpose being there, and they were actively engaged in the lesson and definitely being exposed to more curriculum had they not had, their gen ed peers around them to add in information. So we want to make sure that, again, to the highest extent possible, that the student is in the back of the classroom coloring, right? Or doing something that's really not, related to what's happening, right? Also that the classroom teacher relies on, if the classroom teacher is over relying on the paraprofessional or the aide's knowledge of the student, I question that too, because again, that's your student, and that student is equally yours as any of the others. Yes, the aide or the special ed teacher may come in with some, hey, guess what just happened a couple of classes ago? I just want to give you a heads up. But as far as that student's IEP, that student's learning style, that is just as much the responsibility of the gen ed teacher as the other related service providers. And that includes the specialist teachers. So if your student is getting pushed out into art, music, PE, they too should have an understanding of what the goals are and how to differentiate. So all very important. Let's see. Yes. Yeah. And as I said, the emphasis on peers is very important, and making sure peers are actively involved in the collaboration. All right, next slide. All right, so the importance of peers. When we are setting up activities in the classroom, often we will make sure that we are pairing kids that have IEPs and students with special needs with students that can either be mentors, or maybe even students that can just have a good sense of like how to co-regulate, right? Or maybe their organizational skills are different, so they can support the student in terms of checking their agenda or staying on task. And when, to the greatest extent possible, when we talk about least restrictive environment, I also think about least restrictive experience, right? When I'm in the classroom, if I'm, constantly being kind of prodded and prompted by my aide or by the special ed teacher, then I'm really becoming a kind of more dependent student, right? That's not how the typical experience goes. But if I can start accessing the resources in that classroom, like other children, like being able to, have something, adapted to my level, then I can be more independent. And that is ultimately our goal. In fact, I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the other trainings that we will do sometimes is work with aides and even teachers on least restrictive prompting, so a prompt hierarchy. So I don't always want to be telling students what to do or guiding it, or even worse, doing it for them. I want to be able to use those least restrictive, resources in the classroom. So one could be peers, right? Gee, I wonder what Jack's doing over there. It looks like Jack's getting ready for math. Having the student reference a peer, having a student work more directly with a peer, so that there's that, that more, age appropriate kind of interaction happening. And that's also going to improve their social experiences as well. So, on the peers part, it really does build their sense of empathy, their sense of problem solving, and really being able to adapt, right? Being able to focus and adapt, so that they can, those are life skills for them as well. One of the nice things, and I'm probably not going to have a whole lot of time to talk about this, but in a lot of the schools that we've consulted and we've worked on doing some peer mentoring and what we call a peer network program, where we've been able to train and help support neurotypical students, kids without IEPs, on specifically how to coach their peers, or how to be available to them as resources, particularly when they're not in the classroom, because that's when things are most difficult, especially at the middle school and high school level. Maybe there are times in the, in the PE locker room, maybe there are times at the bus stop, in the cafeteria, during hallway transition times, all those times when maybe there isn't a whole lot of adult supervision or intervention. This is where the peers become even more critical. So these programs have been, I think, very imperative and useful to helping with the least restrictive continuum, because now we're really truly accessing a huge resource of unpaid employees, more or less, and they love it. I mean, a lot of the kids really enjoy kind of taking on that mentorship role, and even to the point where it moves away from being a mentor and more of a maybe a connection or a friendship, which is wonderful. And being able to even have those students even pair up after school for any extracurricular activities or clubs or things that are out in the community. Right now we're working with a local agency called Bring on the Spectrum, that's in Albany, that serves it's a private place that's more of a sensory gym, but it's really evolved into much more than that, where there's social skills groups and parent trainings, and we're working on developing a peer network in the community. So we've connected with the local Girl Scout groups and have many sessions already starting to be filled up of doing some of this peer training, and hoping that that will evolve it into the community, because it's been so successful in the schools. So taking advantage of those unpaid workers who really do some really rise to the occasion. And one of the things I like about utilizing peers too is that they sometimes understand things at a much different level than we will. So how a 12-year-old boy greets another 12-year-old boy or girl, is going to sound probably a lot different than if coming from a 12-year-old and it coming from a 54-year-old. So it's definitely more authentic, and it's more likely to generalize. And I'm not just talking about the social skills, but also the behavioral aspect of it, right? Self-control, what's expected behavior in a 7th grader, what's expected behavior in a 10th grader. These are really lessons that a lot of the peers can really be helpful for. And anytime we've had any of these meetings, they really come up with some really creative ideas, which is nice to see. In fact, some of the students have even gone on to college to start their own mentor programs and even study special education or psychology, which is nice. Okay, let's see. Right, so again, the importance of peers as peer mentors. I think that's my last slide. I can't see the slides anymore on the presentation, but I think that was the last one. Any questions or comments?
I am looking in the chat. If anyone has any questions, please put them in there now. While we wait for those, I'm going to put a link to the evaluation in the chat. I'm also going to pause the recording.